It was 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in April, when Deborah Kessler walked her Pomeranian past 214 Sycamore Bend Lane, saw a white cane folded against the porch railing and a small black charging case sitting on a wicker table, and decided that the Whitfield family had finally given her something to work with. She didn't knock. She didn't call. She let the dog's leash drop, walked up 3 steps she wasn't invited onto, picked up the cane, and snapped it against her knee until the joint cracked. Then she scooped the charging case off the table, carried it to the curb, and dropped it into the green recycling bin, as if she were discarding a fast food wrapper. On her way back down the walkway, she pulled a yellow carbon copy violation notice from her tote bag, filled in the date, and wedged it into the Whitfield's screen door. Violation notice. Willowbrook Cove Estates HOA Section 7.3. Unauthorized storage of personal items on exterior common view areas fine. $250. Effective immediately. Daily accrual of $50 until item is removed. The item in question had already been removed. Deborah Kessler had removed it herself, with her hands, off a porch belonging to an 8-year-old girl who was blind and wore hearing aids in both ears, and who would come home from her cousin's birthday party in 11 minutes, expecting her cane exactly where she'd left it. This is the story of what happened after that. Every neighborhood believes its HOA president is the worst one in the country. Willowbrook Cove Estates, tucked into the rolling cul-de-sacs of Maple Hollow, Georgia, about 35 minutes northeast of Atlanta, had reason to believe it more than most. Deborah Kessler had served as board president for 6 consecutive years, a record made possible by a bylaw quirk nobody had bothered to fix, low voter turnout, and a filing cabinet of proxy forms that she alone controlled the key to. She ran the community the way some people run a small, deeply resented kingdom, with binders. Binders of violations. Binders of before and after photographs. A laminated copy of the CC&Rs that she carried in her purse like a badge, thick enough to stop a bullet, thin on the parts that limited her own authority. The Whitfields had moved into Willowbrook Cove 18 months earlier. Sarah Whitfield ran a small event planning business out of a converted sunroom. Her husband, Captain Mark Whitfield, flew Boeing 737s for Meridian Airlines out of Hartsfield-Jackson, gone 4 to 6 days at a stretch, and home in bursts that his daughter had learned to treasure the way other kids treasured holidays. Lily Whitfield was 8 years old, blind since birth, from a condition called Leber's congenital amaurosis, and moderately deaf in both ears, from an unrelated auditory nerve disorder that had been managed since infancy with a pair of behind-the-ear hearing aids she called, without irony, her listening machines. She used a white cane with a rolling tip, the kind occupational therapists call an identification cane once a child ages into full mobility training, and she was, by every account from her teacher, her orientation and mobility instructor, and the entire cul-de-sac except one resident, remarkably good at getting around on her own. Drop your city, and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many of you are watching this from behind enemy lines right now. Sarah had chosen Willowbrook Cove for the schools and the sidewalks. Real sidewalks, curb-cut ramps at every corner, a rarity in newer Georgia developments that Lily's mobility instructor had specifically flagged as ideal for a blind child learning to navigate a neighborhood independently. Nobody had mentioned that the HOA president considered sidewalk curb cuts a personal affront to property values, or that she'd spent 4 years lobbying unsuccessfully to have them landscaped over before the county reminded her, in writing, that curb ramps were federally mandated infrastructure and not, in fact, hers to remove. Deborah Kessler had opinions about the Whitfields from the beginning. She had opinions about the modified basketball hoop lowered to accommodate a child who couldn't see it, but could hear the bounce and find it by echo. She had opinions about the small tactile garden path Sarah had installed along the side yard, a strip of textured pavers Lily used to orient herself between the driveway and the back door, which Deborah described in an email to the board as an eyesore inconsistent with the community's Mediterranean craftsman aesthetic guidelines. She had opinions, delivered at every board meeting whether or not the Whitfields were on the agenda, about special treatment, and the rules applying to everyone, and this isn't about the little girl, it's about precedent. It was, everyone would later agree, entirely about the little girl. The cane and the charger were not new additions. Lily had been using the porch as a staging area for 8 months, leaving the cane to air dry after wet mornings, since Sarah had read that damp rubber grips degraded faster, and charging the hearing aids on the covered porch table because the dehumidifier there kept the batteries from swelling in Georgia's humidity, a tip from her audiologist. Nothing about either object was hidden. Nothing about either object was new. What was new was that Deborah Kessler had just lost a board vote 3 weeks earlier, 4-1, on a proposal to ban trampolines community-wide, and had spent the intervening weeks looking for a fight she could win outright, unilaterally, with her own 2 hands and a violation pad. She found it on a Tuesday evening in April, and she tore it in half against her own knee. Now that you know Lily Whitfield, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has ever done, because I promise you, it's about to get worse than you think. Lily came home from the birthday party at 6:58 p.m., 11 minutes after her cane stopped existing in its previous form. She went to the porch table first, the way she always did, hands moving in the practiced sweep her orientation training had drilled into her since she was 4. Cane first, always cane first. It's your third hand, her instructor used to say. Her hand found the wicker table. It found the space where the charging case should have been. Did not find the cane against the railing, because the cane, in 2 pieces held together by a thread of fiberglass core, had been shoved into the recycling bin along with the charger, out of some instinct in Deborah Kessler that even she couldn't later explain, a need to erase the evidence rather than simply discard it. Sarah found her daughter sitting on the porch steps, perfectly still, the way Lily went still when the world stopped making sense to her hands. "Mommy," she said, "someone took my cane." Sarah checked the porch. She checked the yard. She checked, on a hunch she'd later be grateful for, the recycling bin at the curb, and found her daughter's white cane snapped in 2 and her $1,400 hearing aid charging dock sitting in a puddle of rinsed-out cottage cheese containers. Wedged in the screen door was the yellow violation notice, informing the Whitfield family that they owed the Willowbrook Cove Estates HOA $250 immediately for the crime of storing personal items in a common view area. Sarah Whitfield did not sleep that night. She spent it on the phone with her husband, who was somewhere over Nebraska at the time, unable to do anything but listen and feel the particular helplessness of a father 4 miles above the ground, while his daughter sat in her bedroom, clutching a broken cane like a splint on a limb that hadn't actually broken, but felt, to an 8-year-old, exactly like it had. The next morning, Sarah drove to Briarcliff Property Management, the outside firm Willowbrook Cove contracted to enforce the CC&Rs, though everyone in the neighborhood understood that enforcement mostly meant whatever Deborah wants typed on letterhead, and asked, calmly, who had entered her property and destroyed her daughter's mobility device. The property manager, a soft-spoken man named Curtis Boyle, who had clearly had this exact conversation about Deborah Kessler more times than his salary justified, pulled up the violation file. "Ma'am, per the notice, this was issued for a Section 7.3 violation. Storage of personal items on the exterior. It was my daughter's cane. She's blind. It's not personal items. It's a mobility aid, and someone came onto my porch and broke it." Curtis Boyle looked for a moment, like a man watching a car he knew was going to crash, slowly enough to see every second of it. "I'll flag this for board review," he said. The board met on the second Thursday of the following month, as it always did. in the community clubhouse, with the water-stained ceiling tile the reserve fund had been reviewing for 3 years. Sarah requested to be added to the agenda. She was given 4 minutes. She used every second of them describing what her daughter did every night now, sitting on her bed, running her fingers along the fiberglass brake line of her old cane, which the mobility specialist had said couldn't be repaired, only replaced, at a cost of $340 that insurance didn't cover, plus a 6 to 8 week wait for a properly fitted replacement from the state's Vision Services program. She described Lily refusing, for the first time in 2 years, to walk to the mailbox alone. She described the hearing aid charger, cracked from the fall into the recycling bin, now held together with electrical tape, because Meridian's insurance plan classified hearing aid accessories as non-covered durable medical equipment, and the family was waiting on a claims appeal. Deborah Kessler, seated at the center of the folding table with the gavel she'd bought herself because the board had never budgeted for one, listened with an expression of profound, performative patience. When Sarah finished, Deborah said, "I understand this is emotional for you. But Section 7.3 is Section 7.3. It doesn't have an exception for—" She paused, as if searching for a delicate phrase and coming up empty. "Special circumstances. If we start making exceptions, where does it end?" "She's disabled," Sarah said. "That's not a special circumstance. That's federal law." "I'm not a lawyer," Deborah said, in the tone of someone who considered this a strength rather than a disqualifying admission. "But I do know the CC&Rs, and they don't say anything about disabilities." They did, in fact, say something about disabilities. Section 14.2 of the Willowbrook Cove Estates Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. The section Deborah Kessler had never once quoted in 6 years of citing every other section from memory, stated that the association would comply with all applicable federal, state, and local fair housing laws, including reasonable accommodation requests for residents with disabilities. Sarah didn't know that section existed yet. She would, very soon. The board voted 3-2 to uphold the fine. Deborah Kessler broke the tie. $250 over a blind 8-year-old's cane and hearing aid charger. Against Lily Whitfield. "Is this even legal where you live?" What would you have done in that meeting? What followed over the next 6 weeks was not an isolated incident but a campaign, and Sarah began keeping a folder. She would later be told by an attorney that this folder was the single most valuable thing she did in the entire ordeal. Of every letter, every photo, every date-stamped notice that arrived in the Whitfield mailbox. May 3rd. A second violation notice. This one citing the tactile garden pavers along the side yard as an unauthorized hardscape modification under Section 5.7, requiring Architectural Committee pre-approval that Sarah had in fact requested and received 8 months earlier, a fact the committee's own paperwork confirmed. Buried in a filing cabinet, Curtis Boyle eventually located only because Sarah asked him to, in writing, 3 times. May 9th. A formal letter from the association's attorney, a semi-retired lawyer named Gerald Osei, who billed the HOA $185 an hour to send letters he clearly hadn't read closely, informing the Whitfields that continued non-compliance with Section 7.3 would result in the fine escalating to $500 and the matter being referred for lien placement on the property. May 14th. Deborah Kessler filed a second complaint, this one alleging that the sound of Lily's white cane tapping the sidewalk during her morning walk to the bus stop constituted a noise disturbance under the community's quiet hours provision, which technically applied only between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Lily caught the bus at 7:12. Deborah had, apparently, been standing at her own window with a stopwatch. May 22nd. The HOA levied a special assessment of $85 per household, community-wide, to cover unanticipated legal consultation fees. The fees, it would later come out, generated almost entirely by Gerald Osei's correspondence regarding one family's porch. Sarah requested the meeting minutes and financial records under Georgia's Property Owners Association Act, which, unlike some states, gives homeowners a statutory right to inspect HOA books, records, and minutes upon written request. Curtis Boyle stalled for 11 days before producing a partial set, missing exactly the pages covering the board's internal discussion of the Whitfield violations. Sarah made a note of the gap. She would come back for it. By late May, 3 separate violation notices sat unpaid. The total owed had crept to $890, and a letter arrived from Briarcliff Property Management warning that the association's attorney had been instructed to prepare a lien filing against 214 Sycamore Bend Lane if the balance wasn't settled within 30 days. A lien against a family's home, over a blind child's cane and a strip of textured pavers that the architectural committee had already approved in writing. Neighbors noticed. Not all of them helped. This was still a neighborhood where half the residents were too frightened of Deborah Kessler's memory for grudges to say anything out loud. But a few started leaving notes in the Whitfield's mailbox instead of the yellow violation kind. A retired schoolteacher 2 doors down, Marion Petrakis, mentioned over the fence that Deborah had done something similar to a resident with a wheelchair ramp 3 years back, before Sarah moved in, and that the resident had eventually just left, sold the house at a loss, and moved to unincorporated county land with no HOA at all, just to make it stop. Sarah began to understand that this wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up. It was a pattern, with a body count of quietly departed families, and she was the latest name on the list. Mark came home from a 4-day rotation in the first week of June to find his daughter sleeping with her new, temporary loaner cane, a bulkier, unfamiliar model from the Vision Services program, propped against her nightstand instead of the porch because she no longer trusted the porch. He found his wife with a folder 3 inches thick and dark circles she hadn't had 2 months earlier. He found a lien notice on the kitchen counter with a filing date 11 days out. "Explain it to me again," he said, sitting down at the table still in his uniform. "From the start." Sarah explained it again. From the start. Mark just made a critical move. He called in sick to a scheduled trip, grounded himself for a week, and told his crew scheduler he had a family emergency that wasn't going anywhere until it was handled. Was that the right call? What's your strategy when a fight like this lands on your own porch? Mark Whitfield had flown for 11 years. He had a captain's understanding of 2 things relevant to what came next: procedure, and the fact that procedure only protects you if you actually invoke it. He also had, it turned out, a law school dropout roommate from his Air Force Rotke days who now practiced HOA and fair housing litigation out of a small firm in Alpharetta, and who took Mark's call at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday and stayed on the phone for 90 minutes without billing a cent of it. The attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Nair, laid out what the Whitfields actually had, which was more than they realized. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act, HOAs are required to provide reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities, and a request doesn't need to use magic legal words to trigger that obligation. It just needs to put the association on notice that a disability-related need exists. Lily's cane and hearing aid charger, stored in a location that let them function properly for a documented disability, were about as textbook a reasonable accommodation case as Priya had seen in years. The fact that Deborah Kessler had physically damaged the cane elevated the matter from a fair housing violation into potential property damage and, depending on how the board's minutes read, evidence of a pattern that a board president had breached her fiduciary duty to act even-handedly and, within the law, on the association's behalf. "Here's what we're going to do," Priya said. "First, we submit a formal, written reasonable accommodation request. Today, certified mail, so there's a clock running. Second, we file an open records request for every violation notice this board has issued in the last 3 years, broken down by resident, because if there's a pattern of selective enforcement, that's your leverage. Third, we document everything, every notice, every board minute, every dollar. And fourth, she paused. How do you feel about public meetings? I fly airplanes for a living, Mark said. I've stood in front of a cabin full of people during an engine-out scenario. I think I can survive a folding table. The reasonable accommodation request went out on June 4th, certified, return receipt requested, citing 42 U.S.C. Section 3604.f, 3b, and Georgia's parallel fair housing provisions, requesting written confirmation within 10 business days that Lily Whitfield would be permitted to store her cane and hearing aid charging equipment on the covered porch as a disability-related accommodation, and requesting that all associated fines be reimbursed. The open records request went out the same day, invoking the Georgia Property Owners Association Act's inspection provisions, demanding 3 years of violation notices sorted by household, 3 years of board meeting minutes, and all correspondence regarding architectural committee approvals for the side yard pavers Sarah had already been granted in writing. Curtis Boyle, to his credit, forwarded both requests to the board within the hour, along with what Sarah would later learn was an unusually blunt internal email. I wanted on record that I flagged the fair housing exposure on this back in April. Deborah Kessler's response, delivered 4 days later through Gerald Osei, was that the association denies any wrongdoing and would respond to the accommodation request within the time frame required by law, which was legal speak for waiting until the 10th business day and no sooner. While the clock ran, Sarah did not wait quietly. She started, on Priya's advice, keeping what amounted to a public record of her own. Not a social media campaign, not yet, but a careful, dated log posted in a private neighborhood forum that most of Willowbrook Cove actually read, describing exactly what had happened, exactly what the CC&Rs and federal law actually said, and exactly what documents had been requested and when. She didn't call anyone names. She didn't have to. The dates did the work. 3 other families responded within days. 1, the Alvarezes at 340 Birchwood Court, had been fined $175 the previous winter for a wheelchair ramp railing Deborah had deemed insufficiently matching the home's craftsman trim color. Another, an elderly widower named Harold Tran, had received 2 separate violation notices for a service dog's outdoor water bowl, which Deborah had cited as unauthorized yard equipment, the same section, the very same Section 7.3, used against a blind child's cane 6 weeks later. A pattern was forming, with a paper trail attached to it, and the paper trail had Deborah Kessler's initials on every notice. Sarah forwarded all of it to Priya. Priya forwarded a summary to the Georgia Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, which handles complaints of this kind against community associations, along with a copy to a HUD Regional Fair Housing Office, flagging what now looked less like one bad decision and more like a documented pattern of disability-based selective enforcement. Drop your worst fine story below. No, wait. Sarah didn't need to ask that. The neighborhood was already doing it for her. 1 comment at a time, in a forum thread that had grown to 40 replies by the 2nd week of June, most of them some version of, I didn't say anything before because I was scared of her. I'm not scared anymore. On June 18th, the 10th business day, Gerald Osei's response arrived. It did not grant the accommodation request. It offered, instead, what he called a compromise. Lily could store her cane and charger on the porch, provided they are concealed from street view using an appropriate storage container, to be selected from the association's approved exterior storage catalog, subject to architectural committee approval. The letter also declined to rescind the fines, though it noted, almost as an aside, that the association is willing to discuss a reduced settlement amount. Priya read it twice and started laughing, not kindly. They just admitted, in writing, that a disabled child's mobility equipment needs board pre-approval to exist on her own porch. This letter is a gift. It was also, technically, a denial, a partial one, dressed up as a concession, and under the Fair Housing Act, a denial of a reasonable accommodation, however it's dressed, is a denial. Priya filed a formal HUD fair housing complaint the following morning, attaching the accommodation request, the response, the violation history for the Whitfield, Alvarez, and Tran households, and, because Sarah had, at Priya's suggestion, finally gotten Curtis Boyle to hand over the full, ungapped set of meeting minutes under threat of a records inspection lawsuit. 3 years of board minutes, in which Deborah Kessler was recorded, in her own words, referring to accommodation requests as the thin end of the wedge, and stating that granting one exception opens the floodgates. The association's June board meeting was scheduled for June 25th. Sarah requested agenda time again. This time so did 4 other households. Curtis Boyle, perhaps sensing which way the wind was turning, or perhaps simply exhausted, granted all 5 requests without a fight. After everything Lily went through, was it worth it, watching her own family have to fight this hard just to keep a cane on a porch? Have you ever had to fight your HOA over something federal law was already supposed to protect? Tell me your story, because I want to hear it. The clubhouse on June 25th was fuller than anyone could remember. Word had traveled the way it does in cul-de-sacs, porch to porch, forum thread to forum thread, and by 6:45 p.m., the folding chairs meant for maybe 25 residents held closer to 60, with people standing along the back wall near the water-stained ceiling tile that had never once, in 3 years, made it onto a reserve fund line item for actual repair. Deborah Kessler called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. sharp, gavel in hand, visibly unsettled by the turnout, but committed, as always, to the appearance of total control. She moved through the routine business quickly. Minutes approved, treasurer's report read by Ron Pruitt in a voice that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, and arrived, finally, at new business, where 5 names sat on the agenda in the order they'd been submitted. Harold Tran went first, describing, in the plain, unhurried cadence of a man who'd raised 4 children and buried a wife and had nothing left to fear from a woman with a gavel, exactly what had happened to his service dog's water bowl and exactly what the 2 violation notices had cost him in stress he didn't have room for at 78 years old. The Alvarezes went second, describing the wheelchair ramp fine, the color-matching demand, the 11-week wait for an architectural committee review that turned out to be Deborah Kessler alone, in her kitchen, deciding a color swatch didn't match a trim she'd never actually measured. Then Sarah stood, and Mark stood beside her, still in the pressed white shirt and 4 gold stripes of a Meridian captain, because he'd come straight from a delayed simulator session and hadn't had time to change, and the effect of that uniform in a community clubhouse, whatever anyone wants to say about theater, did something to the room's attention that 4 minutes of pure argument might not have managed alone. "My name is Mark Whitfield," he said. "I fly airplanes for a living. I've spent 11 years being trained to stay calm when something's gone badly wrong, so I'm going to try to do that now, but I want to be honest with you. It's been a hard few months to stay calm." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He described his daughter sitting on the porch steps at 6:58 p.m. on an April evening, hands searching a wicker table for a device that wasn't there anymore, because Deborah Kessler had climbed 3 steps onto private property, snapped an 8-year-old's mobility cane against her own knee, and thrown a $1,400 medical device into a recycling bin like garbage. He read, aloud, from the letter Gerald Osei had sent 3 days earlier, the one requiring architectural committee pre-approval before a blind child could be permitted to keep her cane on her own porch. He let the room sit with that sentence for a moment before he went on. "I've read the CC&Rs," he said. "Section 14.2 says this association will comply with federal and state fair housing law. I'd like someone to explain to me how tonight's letter complies with anything." Deborah Kessler tried, twice, to interject with point of order, and was overruled both times. Not by a parliamentary procedure Sarah had studied in advance, though she had, but by the simple fact that 50-some neighbors in folding chairs had stopped extending her the deference that 6 years of unchecked authority had trained everyone to give automatically. The silence that met her second interruption was its own kind of vote. Priya Nair, present as counsel and permitted, under the bylaws Deborah herself had once cited to silence other speakers, to address the board directly, laid it out plainly. A HUD fair housing complaint had already been filed. The Georgia Attorney General's office had opened an inquiry into the association's enforcement pattern following complaints from 3 separate households. The board's own meeting minutes, obtained, finally, in full, after weeks of stonewalling that a records inspection lawsuit would have made considerably more expensive for the association than simply producing them, documented Deborah Kessler, describing accommodation requests as something to be resisted on principle rather than evaluated on merit, a position that put both her and, by extension, every board member who'd voted alongside her at personal risk of liability for breach of fiduciary duty. "You have 2 options tonight," Priya said. "You can rescind these fines, reimburse the documented damage, grant the accommodation as originally requested, with no storage container caveat, and this board can begin repairing what 6 years of selective enforcement have done to this community's trust. Or this becomes a lawsuit, a HUD finding, and an Attorney General enforcement action, and every one of you sitting up there personally explains, under oath, why a child's hearing aid charger required architectural committee review." The vote came 90 minutes later, after public comment ran long enough that 2 board members quietly signaled to Curtis Boyle that they wanted the matter off the table before the meeting hit its second hour. It was 4-1. Every fine against the Whitfield, Alvarez, and Tran households was rescinded. The association agreed to reimburse the cost of Lily's cane and hearing aid charger in full, plus attorney's fees the family had incurred, a total of $2,110. The accommodation was granted without a storage container requirement. And a motion, introduced by Ron Pruitt of all people, in what Sarah suspected was less a change of heart than a man doing the math on his own personal liability, called for a special recall election on Deborah Kessler's position as board president, citation Article 9 of the bylaws, to be held within 60 days. Deborah Kessler cast the lone dissenting vote on her own reimbursement motion, gavelled the meeting to a close 11 minutes later than scheduled, and left through the side door before the applause. Muted, disbelieving, the kind of applause that comes from people who aren't sure yet whether they're allowed to feel relieved, had fully died down. The recall election was held on the last Saturday in August, in the same clubhouse, under the same water-stained ceiling tile, which by then had finally, almost symbolically, been scheduled for replacement under a reserve fund line item the new interim board approved in its first working session. Turnout hit 71% of eligible households, a number Curtis Boyle said he'd never seen in 9 years of managing the property. Deborah Kessler was recalled by a vote of 118-34. She did not attend the count. She sold her house 8 weeks later and moved, neighbors reported with a specific and not entirely charitable satisfaction, to a townhome community 2 counties over that, as far as anyone could confirm, had no homeowners association at all. The Georgia Attorney General's inquiry closed in October with a formal advisory letter to the new Willowbrook Cove Board, outlining the association's obligations under state and federal fair housing law and requiring, for the next 3 years, an annual compliance certification. The HUD complaint resolved through a conciliation agreement rather than a full finding, which meant no admission of guilt was required, but it also meant a permanent binding requirement that the association maintain a written, board-adopted reasonable accommodation policy, reviewed by Fair Housing Council and available to any resident on request. Lily got her new cane in the second week of July, properly fitted this time, longer than the old one to match a summer growth spurt her mobility specialist hadn't accounted for, with a rolling tip her instructor said would hold up better against Georgia sidewalks. She keeps it on the porch table now, out in the open, next to a hearing aid charging dock the association's reimbursement check paid for in full. Nobody has touched either one since. The new board, seated that September, adopted a written reasonable accommodation policy in its first 60 days, the exact policy Deborah Kessler had spent 6 years insisting the CC&Rs didn't require. Harold Tran's service dog water bowl sits by his front door, unremarked upon, for the first time in 2 years. The Alvarez family repainted their ramp railing the color they'd wanted in the first place. Mark Whitfield went back to flying full schedules that fall, though he still tells the story, carefully, without names, the way pilots learn to tell every story, to other captains on long layovers, usually ending with the same line, that the hardest thing he ever did in a uniform wasn't a diversion or a mechanical issue at 35,000 feet. It was standing in a community clubhouse and reading a letter out loud that required his daughter to hide her cane from the street. Sarah still keeps the folder, 3 inches thick, every notice, every letter, every date. She says she doesn't need it anymore. Not really. She keeps it anyway. If you learned anything from Lily Whitfield's story tonight, subscribe, because there are more of these coming. And somewhere out there, another Deborah Kessler is filling out a violation notice right now, certain nobody's going to stand up. Let's prove her wrong.